Hello everyone, and welcome to our second webinar. It's automation, not auto magic. What can you solve? My name is Chetan Joshi. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Margin Reform. Before I hand over to Sean Murray, our CEO, I'll go through quickly some housekeeping rules around the webinar. The first thing we want to talk about is the chat channel is disabled. So as you see on the screens here, on the bottom you have three options. The chat channel, the raise a hand. So throughout the webinar, we might ask for participation. So you can press the raise a hand to see if there's a consensus on a certain area. If we use that functionality, and also the Q&A. So the Q&A, the question and answers, is an option for you to ask us questions throughout the webinar, and we encourage you to ask those questions. And then we can answer them live, or we can type back those answers. We also will be running a couple of polls, so throughout the webinar, hold tight for those polls, and we also be giving away a few high quality content at the end of the webinar. I'm now going to hand over to Sean Murray, and thank you for joining our webinar.
Thank you, Chetan. Hi, welcome. As Chetan says, it's the second in season 1 of our Margin Reform webinar series. I'm Sean Murray. I am the CEO of Margin Reform, and I'll be moderating today's session. I have 2 guests with me today, and we will be exploring the collateral and margin domain, looking at what's happened in the past month, looking at some recent events in the collateral margin domain, and looking to the future and what the future holds. So let me introduce my colleagues who have joined me today. I have Nick Lario. Nick is the head of EMEA sales at the DTCC Europe. And I have Scott Brown, who is the business development manager at Pyram Systems. Welcome, gentlemen. You will see that both scrubbed up nicely for the event as well, which is great. So I'm looking to have a very interesting session, informative session today with you. We'd like to keep it interactive as well. So please, as Chetan suggested, chuck in some questions when you'd like to. If you want to raise your hand to ask a question, please do, but just as equally go onto the Q&A channel and we will pick the questions up there. So let's get stuck into it. The most recent change to the industry, there's been a couple actually in the past month, but let's start with the one that's gone live, SFTR. So phases 1 and 2 of SFTR have gone live on July the 13th. And with all regulatory go-lives, that's sometimes tinged with a level of skepticism. There's generally some challenges across the industry, some challenges internally at different firms. So what I want to do is just investigate a little bit with the panel about what they've seen. So 2-pronged question. Firstly, what's happened internally at the firms? Has it been a success? Has it been deemed a success? How have you guys found it? And then secondly, what have the clients been coming to you with? What have the problems been? And I'm hoping that will draw us then into the next stage of the question. Let's start with Scott on that one, if we can, at Pyram.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Sean. I'm going to start off with a positive statement. I think a lot of people feel that this has been a success. The first 2 phases of SFTR. I'm not sure how many of those have shared that outside of their firms for obvious reasons, but I think the industry has proven that a community of people works best when it's working together and when it prepares. The industry working groups and the vendors that have hosted DPG style sessions in preparation over the last few years have certainly done a duty to the industry. ESMA tweeted on day 1 of the reporting that all 4 TRs opened their systems and started receiving and processing SFT data with no disruptions. Citing after that the first week had gone smoothly. So I think it's always tempting to look at the areas of improvement, and that's certainly something that we as an industry should do. But I think we should acknowledge the fact that it's it has been a successful implementation. Univista said 98% of the reports had passed validation, and if the comparisons that have been made with EMEA, that have been made readily. I think they show that SFTR has been a much smoother transition. So again, kind of echoing the success of that I've touched on. I think as you'll see through the theme of the discussion that we're going to have, a lot of what we talk about will centre around readiness. Pyram and our partners IHS Markit had around 120 desks that were signed to SFTR going into phase 1, and the majority of those clients had started pre-production testing with plenty of time to spare. So this gave them time to reconcile data, remediate issues at source, and improving the preparation is key. So I guess to your second part, what are some of the challenges that we've been dealing with post go live? So we have encountered some specific issues around timing of collateral files, pairing items, and data feeds, but these have been worked through by the team and by our clients in the first few weeks and have been resolved well. feedback from the client and the clients and the industry has been broadly positive. I think, Nick, maybe stealing a quote from your shop here, but I saw a quote saying it's the best go live they have seen at DTCC with pairing rates at the TR compared to the equivalent period for EMEA. So I think, again, on that positive theme. And then we've seen pairing of trades running at 60% matching rates and around 3% with the low rates expected from testing. So, all in all, pretty happy. Production support is working well, spiking client queries as we imagined. But now we're kind of diverting some of our attention to phase 3 and the discussions that are coming up there.
Okay, Nick, anything you'd want to highlight differently to that, or any different challenges from the clients?
No, I think Scott summed it up pretty well, actually. I think the overall experience has been positive. I think the reflection of client feedback since go live has been good. I think even internally, we think that it's been a very positive experience.
Yeah.
We kind of shifted our focus coming into SFTR to really kind of focus on product delivery, but also client experience. So making a lot of changes to kind of really make sure that this was a more positive experience for clients than perhaps earlier regulations. Changing our delivery mechanisms to kind of more following the agile methodology, I think has seen really positive experiences for both us internally, but also for the clients. I think the challenge, which is always a nice challenge to have, and Scott and the guys at Pyram and IHS Market had this as well, is coping with demand, right? We actually just ticked up our 300th client for SFTR last couple of days. So it really shows the measure of success and also the community that's kind of really gathered for SFTR, right? And we've kind of really seen that kind of centralize. And I think, to Scott's point around preparation, that's been fundamental to the success of this. I mean, you're always going to get latecomers, but it's getting the masses through the first hurdles. And I think that's really kind of been the success, has been the preparation. And, hats off to the people who have been involved, right? People that have delivered, the project managers, the vendors, the service providers. I think everybody should really kind of, without waxing lyrical about it too much, should kind of give themselves a pat on the back for what has been, I think, quite a smooth delivery. I'll touch some wood here to make sure that I haven't given it the kiss of death, right? But I think over time we're going to start to see volumes kind of increase, and that might the complexity of the other phases coming in might increase some of the challenges we face. But I think that's something with a positive first go live that we can learn from and hopefully manage that when the buy side come in.
Yeah, 100%. So we're celebrating the successes. I think it's a great thing to do. It's not something we do well enough as an industry, as an industry wide. Maybe internally at firms we do it better. That's good to hear. I think it's really positive, as you both alluded to. So thinking about phases 3 and 4, which go live in October and January respectively, and the success, how do we build on that? How do we ensure that the reproduction of that success of phase 1 and phase 2 does get into the buy sides and then into phase 4 as well? What types of options would you be looking at for them? Is it more of the same? Is there something different they should be doing? What would be your view? Let's start with Nick this time.
Yeah, I think the key to this is going to be, again, preparation. And you'd think largely the majority of those impacted in phase 3 in particular will be already well into their projects. They'll be leveraging the relationships with their counterparties and also their service providers to make sure that they are prepared. They're getting ready now, because the challenge that you will have going into phase 3 and beyond is, if you're not preparing now and you're not engaged with your vendors or your trade repositories, you've not made those kind of selection choices, it's starting to get close to the wire to kind of get onboarded and get through testing. I think for the buy side as well, and we saw it with phase 1. And I think there's going to be challenges where people might assume that they can build to the schemas, and eventually they'll get close to the wire and realize actually they maybe don't have the technical capabilities in-house, or they haven't got the right partner to work with. So I think making sure that they've got an understanding of what the requirements really are, and whether they can cope with building to those, I think, is going to be really key. And so it all stems back to the preparation, right?
But do we, and maybe it's a question for you, Scott, the technical capability, and we see this a lot in regulations where the tier one organisations have got these massive firms, massive amounts of money to spend on it, big teams of experienced regulation. The buy side haven't gone through that tsunami just yet. So do we think the technical capability is there, the technical infrastructure is there? Is it the same infrastructure they need on the buy side to ensure phase 3 and phase 4 are as successful as 1 and 2?
Yeah, it's a good question, Sean. I think there's certainly, the sell side certainly have, more at their disposal to cope with regulation, and we've seen that, historically and also recently. But I think a lot of the buy side, certainly from our perspective, we've seen the buy side present at lots of discussions, and this has gone back, a bit of time now. We've seen them attend a lot of the working groups. So I think there is a readiness there, and I think they've probably been talking to their sell side counterparts and looking at how they can get ready. So I don't think there'll be any fire drills of people rocking up late to try and get a seat or a room at the inn. I think there obviously will be some of those firms that do that, but I'd like to think that in the numbers that we saw for testing that I mentioned a bit earlier, that there's a lot of firms in there that are phase 3 and would have been testing and would have been working with their brokers and getting ready. So I think technology, it would be a barrier, but there's lots of options for the buy side to use, and I think they're aware of the majority of those, either that via their sell side partner or via the market and the good work that people have done to raise awareness of the options available.
Yeah, fair. I think that's a really valid point. I think I urge everybody, same as you two guys, to start early on everything, right? There's no delays here that are going to. Sitting tight is not going to help. That's for sure. And so some of the questions we've been hearing from the buy sides as we've gone out and talked about SFTR have been around margin lending, particularly. Maybe Scott, on the margin lending side, what are the implications for the buy side clients?
Yeah, I think the margin lending is an interesting point. So we've been talking to clients about this for a while now. So ESMA guidance published at the beginning of the year appeared to widen the scope for hedge fund asset managers, but this has subsequently been clarified by the EU Commission, so that it's now the jurisdiction of the fund that will determine the reporting requirement. However, if you do conduct margin lending business, then you will need to report. This may be a one-sided submission in the case of the prime broker, but if however the fund is in scope, then they'll need to report as well. So now it could be the case that the broker will submit 2 sides of the deal on behalf of the fund. We have had some clients that have been seeking to perform weekly reconciliations between their version of the transaction versus their prime broker as a way of ensuring the records in line. Some firms have been doing this manually and only at the end of the month, which obviously can lead to reconciliation delays. So I think there are some important points around margin lending that from the text that perhaps need to be sort of drawn out. And obviously, in phase 1 and 2, we did see submissions on margin lending activity. So I don't know if going forward we're going to see mainly one-sided prime broker submissions, or whether there'll be a number of funds that get caught and have to submit. There's a couple of things I want to just draw out, if you don't mind, Sean. So it's expected that there'll be only one margin lending transaction that will exist between each pair of counterparties at a given point in time, except where the entities agreed contractually have more than one base currency, and the margin loans are determined in relation to each of those. So the SFT will relate to any margin loan or short value in the base currency. The text goes on to speak a little bit about when and where you report that. I guess people can read that at their leisure and me not bring the mood down by getting to chapter and verse on the technicalities. But I think there are some key points in the text that draw out when and where a margin loan should be reported, when it becomes an active SFT inclusion, and when it doesn't. So I urge people to read that if they're not familiar.
It's amazing how much you can find out when you actually read the regulations. There we go. So just one last thing on SFTR here. So you mentioned reporting and how that might work. Do we feel that then there may be requests from buy side to extend delegated reporting? Clearly, a lot of the dealers do that now for EMIR. Could SFTR be extended in that way, Nick?
Yeah, look, I think it's going to be on a broker by broker basis or a provider by provider basis. You would think. I mean, we've had conversations with a lot of banks around provision of of delegated services, but again, it's going to be on a relationship by relationship basis. I can't imagine it would be on a blanket basis. But again, it's part of the preparation piece. We would expect clients to already be there engaged with their counterparties to understand whether they intend to extend that service, because it has been successful under EMEA, right? So
it has, yes. I think
the interesting will be the reconciliation piece. So if they do offer that service, then finding the right tools to provide the reconciliation over what's being reported, making sure they've got access to the data that they can meet their obligations from a reconciliation perspective.
Yeah, interesting point. I think the thing I would sort of highlight there is whether you do delegated reporting or not, reconciliations, you're still responsible. It's still your regulatory requirement. You never get away from that in any regulation. So it's definitely a point to be aware of. But thank you. Okay, so look, let's move on to CSDR and see what's going on there. So big news last week. ESMA announced that they were preparing a new regulatory technical standards to possibly postpone CSDR further by 1 year, so out till February the 1st, 2022. They aim to publish this by September, so I take that to mean August, but knowing Europe and how holidays work, it may be a little bit later than that, I would guess. But what are your thoughts on the announcements? Primarily for the market generally, how the market's reacted, how you guys internally reacting at your respective firms? So let's go with Nick.
So I think, firstly, it's a welcome message for the industry broadly. But I think, again, with all of these things, it should be seen rather than an opportunity to delay projects or to postpone their readiness, as more of an opportunity to prepare. Because I think that's going to be what's key to making it a success. And again, clients should be focusing on automating. The topic of the chat today is around automation, right? There's plenty of industry solutions out there and services for people to get the data that they require for CSDR to be a success. There's clearly still some challenges. Buy-in process is going to be one of those. I'm sure we're going to talk about it later. But really kind of getting the settlement messaging and full kind of no touch almost workflow from a post-trade perspective is going to be imperative. We still see as a key challenge to the industry static data, so SSIs as one of the major causes of fails. How do people move the needle in terms of that? There's inevitably going to be certain fails that are hard to kind of avoid going forward. If you think about securities lending, that might be harder to kind of move the needle on from a timely settlement perspective. But things like bad static data we shouldn't still really be in a position where that is a high cause of settlement fails, given what's out there in the market. But I think it's going to be a challenge. It's whether people can, given the delay, can kind of ring fence budget that they may be allocated to the project and retain that in this year, or whether that then gets pushed, as we've seen for other regulations, again, that we're going to probably talk about later on today.
So I think it's interesting. So the conjecture of what's in or out. So we had Rishi Sunak last month coming out and saying UK post-Brexit will step outside of parts of CSDR, particularly the buy-in penalty amount piece we just mentioned. But thinking about actually what we do know today, and you've just Nick highlighted where you think the industry needs to go, and data is clearly king here. We all know the bad stuff in, bad stuff out, expressed a couple of different ways and has been, I'm sure, on many occasions. But Scott, thinking about how you guys interact then with the clients around CSDR today, nothing really changes, I would hope, in that conversation about their readiness and what they're doing. But maybe you could just give a bit of insight into how ready sort of people are and the level of volume of conversations that are coming into Piram.
Yeah, sure. I think just to touch on the points that Nick made, I think, the delay is perhaps not surprising, but I think it is an opportunity that people should take to get ready. I think, learning from SFTR, the readiness for CSDR, I think the regulation is quite simple in its intention, but quite complex in its application. So I think, the firms that have been inquiring with us, that have been using our fail reports and, joining some of our sessions, I think, my advice would be to continue to do that. we've put out a white paper on this, where we're talking about what we think firms are in control of themselves. So if you look at, some of the things that we mentioned, if you look at your own operating model and you look at, what MIS you have available, why am I failing trades today? What's the root cause? How do I identify those root causes? What can I do about them? I think they're the key things that firms should be focusing on before looking too deeply into the impact. It's almost like you want to be in a preventative mind state rather than a remedial mind state. Because I think once you start looking at the remedial side of things, it can become, quite daunting with the mandatory binds and the fail costs. But I think, we've encouraged clients a lot to look at some of the regulations organic. So looking at how they do things in a best practice environment today, how SFTR impacts that, how CSDR then impacts that, and look at it from a front to back. How can I remove some of these obstacles and some of these concerns by being perhaps smarter and more prepared? So, I think clients are engaging, but I think the message we would like to send is that, engage more, look at your model front to back, look at the vendors at your disposal, look at the tools you have internally at your disposal, and work out, how best equipped you are, because, there are lots of people in firms that get affected by this. So, firms need to make sure that anyone that's playing a role, under this regulation is aware of what role they're playing and who else is in the organisation is affected by it. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to do, but there's some quick wins that you can achieve by, looking at where you are today and what the underlying issues are.
Setting yourself up for success. Success is highly important, as we know, and have gone through both Chetan and I in various guises. But I think looking at the CSDR piece, and we hear a lot about penalties, about binds, and about more of the, onerous parts of it. There's a hell of a lot more going on in CSDR, which I don't see a lot of industry chat about. So things such as documentation would be one. Some of the static data we've talked about, but maybe on the documentation side, have you guys sort of spent any time looking at that and what that might entail?
We've touched on it in a few guises. I think a lot of the stuff I've been reading around the documentation and what CSDs have had to repaper and re-register, and I think some of that's interesting, because I think it kind of not that I think this was a problem before, but I think it kind of unifies the playing field a bit and sets expectations as to what a CSD would need to do in a CSDR environment. There's a few things that I picked up on. I guess Nick talked about static data earlier, but I think that is probably a very key point. I think reference data is not a requirement in the regulatory text, but lack of procedures and monitoring of static data obviously leads to delays, and there's a bit of a spread of opinion in the market about SSIs and the impact of fails driven by SSIs. So clearly having some consistency of data with SSIs, instrument data, counterparty data, all these good things that diligent firms will have a good handle on. They're the things that you need to be in control of. And then the bit I found most interesting, given my OTC background, was around the segregation. So the ISA-OSA segregations that's being offered by CSDs or they're required to offer to their clients, because that's quite a curious point, because of if they're looking at CSD behavior and the protection around defaults then, or enhanced protection, then do you have an ISA construct like a independent individual segregated account, or do you commingle? What's the benefits? What's the costs? How does that work in practice? So I think that'll be curious to see how that plays out. I haven't seen too much narrative on that across the board, but it's definitely an interesting point.
Yeah, it's a challenging one for the industry, I think, in my view. When you've got over 40 CSDs in Europe, all governed by not governed, but the industry body, the European CSD Association, looking after over 40, the balance of who's doing things correctly and who's not is going to probably come to the fore quite quickly, I would think, when we go live eventually. Nick, I want to talk to you about alerts. So Scott just mentioned SSIs. Alert is clearly the DTCC tool. Maybe you could just give us a bit of insight into very quickly what it does and how it works, and then who's on board with it? Is it dealers? Is it buy side? Is it a good mix? And what's the sort of growth trajectory of this CSDR? Is it a catalyst for that?
Yeah, look, I think we've all touched on the fact that static data is a challenge, right? And I think it actually spans across all of the regulations that we've talked about. One of from my background in collateral, and I think Scott will probably recognise this as well. You go from a process whereby historically you know, everybody maintains not just their own SSIs, but their counterparties' SSIs and their collateral management system. So I think the idea behind Alert is that everybody's responsible for their own SSIs. So dealers, investment managers, hedge funds are responsible for the maintenance of their own SSIs. And Alert is basically a utility for the storage of those SSIs, multiple products, so fixed income, equity, derivatives, FX cash, and a number of other asset classes as well. Right? So it's that single storage space for exchanging SSIs. So it takes away a lot of the manual exchange, callbacks, verification process needed. And actually the product has been enhanced over time to actually even further remove the manual element of processing from investment managers by taking direct feeds from custodians. So basically the buy side is then just left with the entitlement process to manage their brokers' access to the SSIs. So today we've got over 3,000 clients globally leveraging the platform, you know, and it's all shapes and sizes. So it's a hugely valued tool by the industry, and I think it's only going to grow with CSDR, and some of the reasons are for that is that, you know, in terms of automation, when we think about fixed income and equity confirmation processes and exchange of SSIs, actually, you know, for the majority, that's already quite a well embedded process. Where technology is leveraged. What we see is the tail,
right?
The manual tail, for example, for the banks where it's still a challenge. Convincing maybe a hedge fund or a small asset manager to come on board with these solutions, industry solutions for exchanging data, is kind of where we are now, really.
No, so I guess the question is how big is the tail, which will come to a conclusion when we start seeing fails.
Yeah, I mean it's a big tail, right? But for any one firm, the tail, those manual clients are always the challenge. Yeah,
but that, just assuming from the SSI perspective, that manual client will be manual with everybody until they use.
Correct.
So
yeah, and the overlap is huge typically. So.
Okay, interesting. Okay, CSDR, very interesting. I think in summary, good market. The market's pleased. We've had the delay, but clearly still look at it, still read it, get going, understand it, talk to your dealers, talk to your vendors, and move forward with it. Let's think about the next let's think about the next 3 to 5 years. So clearly, even in the regulatory world, we're talking about next 18 to 24 months, very busy with SFTR, CSDR. What does that mean for the post-trade environment? So we know that on the reg front, things don't change. There's always going to be regulation. But in the post-trade world, we want technology and innovation to help change that. And do we think that technology and innovation will shape the next 3 to 5 years and be more useful in the sort of non-front office world? Is there automation and efficiency improvements that we can garner there through technology and innovation? Or what do you think over the next 3 to 5, Nick, based on where we are reg-wise as well?
Yeah, look, I think the industry has to continue to automate. I guess one of the things that I have concern with is that cost is no longer just a pressure to the sell side. It's something that everybody's under, and it seems to me that there's less and less budget for anything other than regulatory change. So I think it's going to be a challenge. I think if we're looking 3 to 5 years, where is that kind of budget going to be for clients to spend on further automation, and how do they get that approved if it's not got necessarily a regulatory angle to it? I mean, we should be moving to as I said, to a kind of no-touch workflow from a post-trade perspective. You know, the fact that we still use faxes in collateral and in general settlements is just baffling to me now. I remember sitting next to a telex machine 20 years ago, so good thing is that. But grey hairs to prove it. So I think it's got to be the direction of travel, right? We have to continue to leverage the technology that's out there, whether it's through the existing partners that firms rely on, or whether it's through new innovative technologies. It has to continue to evolve, and I think we're seeing a lot of community plays out in the market. So people like, like the DTCC, but Acadiasoft as well, on the collateral side of things. So I think, we have to evolve. I think one of the things that looks quite interesting for me is looking away from the current email process, and whether people start to really kind of look more seriously at the communication tools out there, things like Taskeyes and Symphony, and how the kind of compliance view at firms will see those kind of tools over time, whether it's something that the industry can get more comfortable with to start to reduce the manual nature of email traffic between firms.
Got it. It's I think a very conclusive answer. So Scott, over to you. Thinking about then that knitting in of what's going on and how people budget today and that regulatory aspect. Is there a straw that breaks the camel's back so people don't just go, right, regulation, I need to go a little bit wider than this and actually think about what's going on in the long-term future rather than getting an immediate ROI?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because I think the reg imperative often drives a lot of decisions, as we've seen. But I think some of the points we've made, and Nick touched on it, I think as a community, I think there is a lot more being done where firms, vendors, etc., are working together and looking at the long term. I mean, we're certainly open to it, and we have been doing that in practice over the years. But I think from a firm's perspective, if you keep layering up vendors and technology, there is going to be a saturation point where the cost is going to be fixed at a higher number. And I have seen it at firms that I've worked at, where lots of things change and different drivers, and before you know it, you've got 500 systems feeding each other and you can't turn them off because there's all these other dependencies. So I think there is, looking to the future, I think there is, technology clearly can help. I think selecting the right technology is the key, and trying to get as much out of the vendor relationships that you have as possible. Because if I was, a sell side firm or a buy side firm looking at technology down the line, I'd be looking to get as much connectivity and as much value and as much automation from those services as possible, because I've got vendor management teams that would be going around doing reviews and a whole heap of security checks and things like that need to be looked at. So I think looking at your model, is it fit for purpose? Is it going to serve you for the long term? Can you change it? Can you revisit parts? Can your vendor relationships do more for you than perhaps you realize they can? So I think it's not necessarily about spending, it's more about consolidating and revising. You'll kind of want that practice to be, every so often you look at your model and you revise it, rather than have big changes, at the end of every 2-year or 3-year period. And that is easier said than done. But I think, good organizations that I've been part of, have done that. Where they've done that well, they've managed to stay in a position where, they can be nimble with which technology they use and who they use for certain purposes, and have a more holistic view about their offering and what they're trying to achieve outside of just hitting a reg deadline.
Yeah, I think it's the way to go. If I think about my experience in some of the larger sell-side organisations, that legacy technology stack is a pain that never goes away, and it's the bit that stops you actually moving forward with technology, or maybe revisiting the stack because everything's connected together so nicely. Thinking about a little bit more about that though, if I go down the route of on the buy side, I've come to the market and front office has clearly been looked after better than back office over the last decade because of regulation and investment and that kind of thing. Do we think the back office is starting to move now into more of that ecosystem? Are you seeing more, I think we've talked about it a little bit already, but more of that ecosystem as it comes together in collateral, that innovation is now starting to spring up? Do you feel that is happening?
Yeah, I do. I think there's, where there was once divisions between front and back office in day-to-day activity, I think it's a lot closer now. I think collateral becoming a more universal kind of thing, and that being more front to back in operations and businesses now. I think that there is a lot more joined up activity going on. So I think in modern day organizations, the front end is driving the back end in a transactional level activity. But I think from a regulatory and efficiency standpoint, they're very much in the same discussion, because you don't want to be making efficient deals in the front end and having a heavy load at the back. So I think I think that's a lot more aligned nowadays, Sean. I think there's a lot more collaboration there.
Yeah, well, I think that as well, which is good. Nick?
Yeah, I think when I think a practical example, if you think about kind of the collateral space, the value to an efficient post-trade space is clear to the front office, right? So understanding where kind of inventory is, understanding where you're failing, and the impact to your inventory, I think is really key for both buy and sell side, right? I think it's, you know, inventory management has historically been a challenge. So I think it's imperative that it's a joined up discussion, and actually we see it very often from our discussions in particular around collateral, that you're not just talking to head of operations. It's much more involved than that, all the way through the client.
Yeah, I think that's fair. We know who takes the losses if the back office makes a mistake. There's no P&L there, right? So it's being joined up with the trading desk to make sure that the errors don't happen as much through efficiency and automation. So I know that I have missed poll question 1 in my excitement of continuing this discussion. So let's make sure I don't miss poll question 2. Chetan, maybe if you can stick that up for us, please. Maybe we'll go back to poll question 1 later. Okay. So which area of post-trade automation interests you the most? I'm not going to read everyone out, but we've got a bit of front office, back office stuff here, some technology and chatbots, new technology, existing technology, improvements, etc. Okay. Okay. Right, so we've got not a lot of votes, but we enhancing tri-party eligibility checks on collateral, which would seem fairly basic, I would think. And there is definitely the technology around today for that to happen. So that's quite interesting. Cool. All right. Let's do poll 1 while we're there, Chetan. Go on. Let's go back. It was a CSDR question. My apologies for missing it. Let's stick poll 1 up as well while we're here. There we go. Right. CSDR. If we can remember back 15 minutes ago, what are your key concerns in complying with CSDR? So we're going to talk about regs, ref data, fines, penalties, internal assessment frameworks and processing efficiency, so governance, quite a lot of the above. Okay, a few more answers pinging on this one, which is great. And as expected, quite a lot of the above is the clear winner, along with the internal assessment framework and processing, actually. So I think it's a settlement regulation to a certain extent, and that's exactly what I would expect to see. And I think quite a lot of the above, it probably expresses where I think the industry is. It's at the starting point of understanding what happens and what they need to do to get there. Guys, any thoughts? Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think it's not really surprising on the CSDR poll. A little bit surprised on the first one. I think, you know, eligibility obviously still does remain a challenge for a lot of firms. You know, Sean and I and Chetan, I'm sure, and probably Nick actually could relate to, you know, manual schedules and ways in which you check eligibility, and it being quite archaic. And probably the reason I've got no hair, Nick, as opposed to the telex machine giving you grey hair. You know, it's quite a tough process. So I think, you know, there are tools out there and there are solutions out there, but I know a lot of firms still struggle with it. So, but again, you know, there are things in the industry that can help with that. So, you know, people should take a look and see what's out there that can help. Yeah.
Okay. So finishing our tech conversation, I'm moving into collateral more generally, and where are we with collateral? So we know that collateral regulation has been going on for some time. Been a huge focus on uncleared margin rules and initial margin. Efficiency. Okay, so we've talked about regulation and efficiency, and some people start late, fall over the line, they remain inefficient, or they may have a slight more efficiency. People who start early tend to be in a better shape because they're able to actually spread their view a bit wider, look more holistically at what's going on. For the regulations have actually happened, so variation margin, let's say, for uncleared margin rules, what do we think could happen there that would be beneficial from an automation perspective to the industry? Because there's been a big focus on initial margin. Variation went live 16, 17. Where do we think the industry's at with that? What are you guys seeing in your firms? What else do you think could happen or be sort of drawn up within the industry that might improve it? Nick, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I could be slightly biased and start talking about margin transit utility and waxing lyrical about how it makes both variation margin and UMR collateral moves much more efficient. But I think realistically, it's still some of the same pain points. It's things like intraday visibility on the settlement of the actual margin. So how do we kind of move away from what is a fire and forget assumed settlement process, and how much value do we put on actually getting real-time settlement confirmations back from custodians, from paying agents, and then also making sure that the SSIs, again, going back to that point and just labouring the point, but again, static data, making sure that the static data is you're managing your own static data for your own firm, not having to manage it for your counterparties. I think they're all kind of what I would consider relatively low touch gains that people could make to their to the systems and the way they're processing. And I think as well, given that people are already under the hood from perspective, can they leverage the time, the budget, the process of evaluating what they're going to be doing for that process to re-examine what they've done for variation margin and make the changes under one kind of, we talked about budget, right? But under one regulatory change umbrella project, because there's clearly synergies and there's going to be challenges on the sell side to the buyer side that are similar. It's around connectivity, automation. You think about the 40 Act fund process where it's still, there's still faxes flying around. How do we move away from those, right? So, I think there's still lots that can be done for variation margin to make it much more seamless. For me, it's the pre-trade piece around SSIs, and then really looking under the hood of confirmation, settlement reporting that can help things, basic stuff like disputes, right? If you know that your collateral is settling or is going to settle or that it's going to fail, you can kind of preempt where there's going to be disputes, right?
Yeah, well, that's it. That's true. I think making use of that internal, I talk about that legacy stack for the sell side of technology they have. You end up in a situation as people change and the turnover happens that people don't understand what particular systems do, and therefore you only use 50, 60, 70% of the functionality, and then functionality gets enhanced. Instead of going and utilising the same system, you end up buying a new one. So Scott, just thinking about that from your perspective, you, Kieran, are obviously big into the repo securities lending world and have made a recent foray into derivatives world. How are you guys seeing that and playing with that and working out how your technology can benefit on the OTC side as well?
Yeah, we are new to the OTC space. That's for sure. We do have quite a few senior or experienced practitioners within our ranks, actually, despite the fact that we are to the market faced as or seen as a SFT institution. But I think we're kind of coming to the market and looking again somewhat to my earlier points around how do you get the most value from a vendor. So if you're agreeing RQVs for securities lending via a tri-party today, what's really different in practice if you're posting initial margin to a tri-party agent in the mechanism. So I think we're looking, and we've made some good headway here in helping firms that have had phases 1 to 4 where they've predominantly put collateral, received collateral at a tri-party agent. They've either leveraged an internal process that perhaps doesn't lend too much scalability, or they've done something to meet the regulation, as you mentioned, Sean, earlier. So when we've gone and revisited conversation with them, they don't necessarily have a scalable model. And then, do they have something that can help if they have third-party custodian connectivity required for phase 5 and 6? Some do, some haven't thought about it. So I think our move into that space has been one that's been welcomed by the market. I think we're offering some practical solutions there, or some optionality around having a scalable solution. Because I always think that if you're moving collateral, and I think, Sean, we touched on it the other day, you don't want to be stealing collateral from someone else that had it earmarked for something else. And so having eligibility checking and controls and You know, that sort of thing, I think is crucial in practice, and operations teams can get frustrated and have a lot of delays and a lot of high touch points, you know, if that process isn't scalable. Because, you know, without dwelling too much on our process, but, you know, there are automated solutions that lift the load from operations teams and allow them just to focus on the exceptions. So that's kind of where we're helping. And I think phases 5 to 6, obviously we're looking to see what volume comes out of that and what's required there, but we're expecting that there will be firms that are, you know, will require collateral to be posted or received at third-party custodians.
It's both of you, thank you on that. I think there is automation out there. It's very clear there is automation out there. It really is, I think, for a lot of firms, just the understanding of how big the collateral ecosystem is these days and who's doing what and how it all knits together. And there's a number of different partnerships over and above the ones you guys have got, where people are bringing different value to the market. But as you've said, both of you have said, it's your starting point. What does your starting point look like strategically? Where are you headed with your collateral book? Do you have a securities financing business and a derivatives business? Are they going to get more joined up? Are your front and your back offices knitted together? I think it's all everything we've been preaching at Margin Reform for some time. It is a holistic product in its own right, collateral, and people really need to start understanding that and working on that, which is great. I know we were going to do, I'm going to come back to you guys a bit in 10, 15 minutes. I don't know if we've got any questions coming in at all, Chetan. I'm trying to look. Okay.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions, so we can pause here and got a question maybe for Scott here coming in. The question is around, I appreciate the emphasis on static data in terms of SSIs, but what are your thoughts on capturing other legal terms that make up collateral agreements, specifically eligibility, which we know to be quite widely spread, automation, and sort of standardizing further?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the legal point, I think, is definitely one that the industry would welcome some kind of automation or some improvement in the current process. I think firms have different ways of doing it, but I think on the eligibility front, I mean, there's a lot of firms, that's included, that have worked to digitize collateral schedules and create eligibility tools for people to check eligibility easily. And I know the poll earlier suggested that that's still a big challenge for people, but what I think I would encourage, I guess, outside of tri-party, because the tri-party agents provide a very good service around eligibility checking, and Nick can relate to that from his experience of working at a tri-party agent, as can I. But I think there are tools out there that make eligibility a lot easier. Obviously, under the UMR, the schedules are broader, so perhaps make it a little bit easier. Yeah, I would encourage anyone that's having trouble with eligibility to see what the market, or what the market can do for them in regards to digitizing schedules, because no one wants to look through a schedule, in a physical format anymore, or a PDF or an Excel. We've all been there and done that. And I think, now's the time for that to be, to be a past requirement.
Yeah, I think it's a great answer. It's a nice little segue into our next slide, which we talk about our industry chit chat. And one of the key areas that's been developed by the industry is around the common domain model. And the common domain model is focusing now on eligible collateral schedules. And I know that, in the middle of this slide here, you can see that ISDA's working on the GEMSLA and the GEMSLA agreements as well. So in the future, those legal agreements will be in a digitized form that you can then sort of consume and use to kind of automate the way you look at your illegal static. So that's really exciting stuff that's happening in the future, and ISDA's driving that with different trade bodies. So it's a great question from the audience there. So thank you.
On that, so ISDA, as you can see on the right-hand side, ISDA and ISLA have actually got into agreed in a collaborative agreement on the CDM, the common domain model, and the expansion of e-contracts. So e-contracts I take to be legal agreements as one part of that, hence the GEMSLA point. But the eligible collateral schedule common domain model problem is something they're trying to solve as well. So actually, do we call it a US Treasury or do we call it a US tip, right? And actually, people being able to understand those differences is something the industry has had a problem with for a decade or more. So I think that digitization is definitely really strong and really required.
Yeah, definitely. Other things that we're seeing on this slide that we put together which are more of a kind of wash up what's happening in the industry, things that we like, conversations that are happening, and things we're passionate about. margin transit utility, and Nick mentioned it, over 50 clients are onto that platform, which is great from my perspective, because it's the collaborative ecosystem getting onto these platforms and able to connect to multiple custodians. So that's something that we really like on that side of things. And Sean, if there's anything else you want to pull out,
things actually. So the bottom one in the middle, target 2 payments and T2S security. So there is an integration plan for those two to combine in Europe. That's actually been delayed, I'm assuming due to COVID, till November 2022. COVID was actually one part. There was some testing issues as well. And then on the right-hand side, the SIM model analysis. So our colleagues at Acadia Soft and Quaternion have recently produced a quick report to talk about the SIM and the period of stress which has gone through. And lo and behold, it's all good, it's positive, which is great. And I think, again, it comes back to that, the collaborative unity that the industry showed back in 2015-14 when the UMR regulations came out, the framework from ECBS IOSCO, and us all working together to get through that together. And that's proven out now that through a period of stress, it has actually stood up and held up from an exceedance perspective. So that's really, really positive. That's all I've got on that, Chevin.
Great. So let's just move on to our next slide, which is around our margin reform insight. So we've worked with the speakers here today to provide you high quality content. So after this webinar, we'll be sending you the articles that we put together around SFTR, margin transit utility, and UMR. So these will coming out to you guys exclusively tomorrow. We're also looking to kick off our survey around the industry temperature check around unclear margin rules. So going out to a number of buy sides and sell sides to understand what everyone's doing with regards to more time with the regulatory delays. And finally, we offer a free discovery course. Anything you want to cover in this webinar or anything else around regulations, feel free to drop us a line and we can go through that with you.
Cool. Okay, so let's go back to our esteemed panel, and it would be remiss of me not to ask them for a couple of final comments. So let's start with Scott. He's on the left. That's easier. So Scott, we've talked for 35, maybe 45 minutes about what's going on in the industry. Really interesting chat, and thank you both for joining us. What would you offer up as either a 1-2 points for the audience to take away, and really why?
I think you probably heard a lot of the themes from Nick and I have been similar. So I'm guessing our final thoughts will be comparable. I think we talked a lot about preparation. I think the firms that have looked at regulation or significant milestones in silo are the ones that are left with an operating model that perhaps is sometimes suboptimal and certainly less automated. So I think firms should try and see the regulation changes as somewhat organic, as I mentioned, but as something that complements best practice. So don't be afraid to revisit decisions that you've made when you had time pressure to meet a deadline. Operating models should be a living thing that are revised and modified. So I encourage people to look back at what they're doing, how it works, and clearly with some of the reg delays, the time is now to do that, and there is time to do that. I just wanted to mention, for me, a lean, efficient, and resource light operating model transcends regulation. So if you get that right and regulation comes along, I think you're in a much better place to cope with that regulation, as opposed to, I think some of the SFTR commentary that's been going on for the last couple of weeks have said some firms have learned more about their business during SFTR than they did before it started. So I think, interrogate your business, interrogate what you're doing, how it works, ask questions, and see where you can improve it. And I did want to leave with a quote, because Will Smith is not the kind of person you'd expect getting quoted in a financial services discussion, but he said a quote that came to my mind when I was preparing, and it says, "If you stay ready, you haven't got to get ready." So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you very much. I'm a big fan of the Fresh Prince. Nick, you're on mute. You're still on mute. There you go. We nearly went an hour.
It was going to happen once. So yeah, I'd echo a lot of what Scott said, but I think preparation. Don't use the delays as an excuse to postpone your projects. Leveraging your service providers, and really taking advantage of the post-trade ecosystem that exists already today. Right, there's a plethora of services and products and providers out there that are well established, or new entrants that are providing really kind of true value adds to make the post-trade fully kind of automated with a no touch full STP. I guess that's the kind of call to action from us is just make sure that you take the time to investigate that.
Yeah, great. Okay, so look, thank you both. I hope that was interesting for everybody. It was certainly interesting for me. I've learned a lot. This is episode 2. Episode 3 is next month, and we will be sending out, post this, the documents that Chetan's already talked about, and following up with a recording of the webinar. If you do have any questions in the meantime that haven't been answered, we'll pick those up in the Q&A and follow up with you. Thank you very much for your time and dialing in. We know it's precious and you're spending too much time on technology, so we appreciate it. That's all from me. Thank you very much, and see you again next month.